This is the first RC that I had in CAT last year. This is the first RC in the shift 1. As always, let's look at the questions first before we look at the passage. Now the first question is, which one of the following, if true, would best complement the passage's findings? Now at this point, remember that complement is a little different from what we've usually seen. We've typically seen questions where we are asked what will support the passage's findings or the author's opinion. But complement is not something that will support, but it is something which will go together or something which might even complete the findings of the passage. So it will be slightly different, but we'll pay attention to what is described in the passage, and then based on that we can answer this question. From the second question, we get to know that there are cuttlefish involved somewhere in this passage. We being asked where the cuttlefish's behavior would demonstrate self-control. So we have 4 scenarios out here, and one of these would be a demonstration of self-control for cuttlefish, which is a type of fish. So again, we'll have to understand what is mentioned about cuttlefish in the passage and then solve this question. Now there's also something called a marshmallow test here. Now marshmallow, as you might know, is something sweet which is edible. It's like a snack. So there's some test related to the marshmallow test, and there are 2 versions of it, the original and the modified. And 3 out of these options that we have are given as differences. So there'll be some differences between the original marshmallow test and the modified one. And 3 of these would be correct differences and 1 would be incorrect. So whichever is incorrect or not mentioned in the passage has to be the correct choice. To solve this, we need to know both the original and the modified versions of the marshmallow test. Once we know that, we can solve this question. Now this last question is also an inferential question. We are being asked which of these 4 options cannot be inferred from a particular person's experiment. So we'll have to look out for Alexandra Schnell's experiment, and 3 out of these would probably either be directly given or can be inferred from that experiment, and whichever one cannot be, that has to be the correct choice. So starting off with the passage here, we get the context right from the first paragraph. We are introduced to Cuttlefish, to Alexandra Schnell, and we find that she's a behavioral ecologist. So she's found that cuttlefish are full of personality. And what she's trying to test is their potential to display self-control. So Alexandra Schnell, who's probably a scientist or behavioral ecologist, she's experimenting with cuttlefish and trying to see if they can display self-control. And that's important because self-control is thought to be the cornerstone of intelligence, or that is something which is a prerequisite or required for intelligence. It's also required for complex decision making and planning for the future. So we definitely have cuttlefish, and Schnell is checking if they have self-control, because that is something that is really required for intelligence. So she's probably trying to see if they display intelligence or something like that. Schnell's study used a modified version of the marshmallow test. Now this is also important because we do have a question on this marshmallow test, the original versus the modified. We have an explanation of the original marshmallow test right here, where there's another psychologist who presented children with 1 marshmallow. Now these children could have that 1 marshmallow then and there, or if they could wait for 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, they would get a second one. So if you want to have one right away, you get only 1. If you're patient enough to wait for 15 minutes, if you can display self-control and not eat the marshmallow for 15 minutes, you end up doubling it and getting 1 more. This is something which was essentially tested on small kids, right? Kids between the age of 4 and 6. Now, the result of this experiment was that the children who waited for the second marshmallow had more success later in life. So here we also understand that self-control is something which is also important for success, at least in the context of humans. So I'll just write H over here for humans. The cuttlefish version of the experiment looked a lot different. The researchers worked with 6 cuttlefish under 9 months old and presented them with seafood instead of sweets. So similar context probably, instead of having marshmallows, they've been giving these cuttlefish seafood and trying to test their self-control. So let's see how Schnell and her team probably are able to do it. So one thing which we learn from this sentence which is in the bracket is that their favorite food is live grass shrimp, while raw prawns are so-so, so they're just okay, and Asian shore crab is nearly unacceptable. Now, whenever we have some fact like this and it's part of an experiment, what I do is I just write this down so that I don't need to come back and find this part later. So from a cuttlefish standpoint, we know that shrimp is what they prefer over prawns, and even prawns are better than crab. Now, the next thing which the author tells us, along with what it is they use instead of marshmallows, is how did they communicate with the cuttlefish. Now, since they couldn't actually talk and explain it, they trained them to recognize certain shapes that would indicate when a food item became available. The symbols that they used were circle is immediate, triangle is delayed, and square is never. So this is the other thing. Again, I'll just write it down so that if we need it later, we have it in the notes instead of having to come back to the passage and try and find it. So a circle means immediate. I'll just write now. Triangle is later and square is never. So what they've done is they've essentially given the prawn which is okay right away and shrimp which is preferable later. So now we can understand how they have sort of modified and reused the marshmallow experiment. Instead of giving one marshmallow right away and then another in 15 minutes if the kid waits, what they've done is the cuttlefish can have the prawn right away, or they can wait a little bit and later they can get the shrimp, which is what they really prefer. In the next paragraph, Schnell explains that a lot of the cuttlefish, while they wouldn't reject the prawns if that was the only food available, if prawns, which is their second preference or which is so-so, was the only thing, they would eat it. But if they know that shrimp is going to come about later, many of them waited for that. And the longest that a cuttlefish waited was 130 seconds. So in the context of cuttlefish, probably quite a long time. So that shows that some cuttlefish can also display self-control just the way as some children can. In the next paragraph, there's one more thing that we learn, that some of these cuttlefish would try to distract themselves. They would turn away from the prawn which they can get then and there. And this is something which has also shown up in other such experiments, not just with humans, but also with chimps, parrots and dogs. So the other thing we know is that the cuttlefish might also try to distract themselves and wait for the shrimp instead of having the prawns then and there. Now we already know that in the case of humans, being able to display self-control means that there's a much greater chance of success later. Now we already know that being able to display self-control or having self-control leads to more success later, but there's one more thing that we learn from the last paragraph. If a species can use self-control, they also might have another trait in common, that is long social lives. So that is one more thing which is their social lives as well as long lives. So I'm just using the greater than symbol to show long. Cuttlefish, however, are solitary creatures. They don't even form relationships with their mates or their young, that is to say their children. So most of the animals or most of the species that display self-control also tend to have long social lives. But in case of cuttlefish, that is something which they don't have because they are solitary creatures. So another expert, psychologist Jennifer Wong, says that we don't know if living in a social group is important for complex cognition unless we also show those abilities are lacking in less social species. So we've proved that self-control is something that's important for intelligence, that's important for success, but we can't say as of now if having a social group or being social creatures is also something which is required. Complex cognition is nothing but being able to use the brain for complex thinking, or for having a lot of intelligence, something of that sort. Cognition of course comes from the brain. Complex cognition probably means to being able to use the brain for more complex tasks as well. Now as of now, while we know these, we don't really know what exactly is the connect between a species being more social and being more intelligent. So that is something which we still don't know. Reason for that, at least from the cuttlefish experiment, is that because the cuttlefish are solitary, we really can't figure it out if it is important. Now we can see that the cuttlefish definitely display self-control and hence they probably have intelligence. But since they are solitary, does that then mean that you could be solitary or you could be social, and in either case you could have complex intelligence? As of now, this psychologist is saying that we don't know the answer to that yet. Now I'm focusing a lot on this because if you remember, we do have a question asking what will complement the study. Now while this is something which we've already figured out, this is the part that is missing. So being able to figure this out could be something which would complement the study. So let's look at that question now that we've understood the passage. So which one of the following, if true, would best complement the passage's findings? So now here we've got to look at all of these as new independent information. Even if any of these options goes against the passage, that's all right. We are just treating it as, let's say, a new setup or even a new universe where we have new information that's just been found. And if this is true, will it complement the findings of the passage? And the findings of the passage are nothing but Alexandra Schnell's findings about the cuttlefish. So we've got to look for something which will complement, which will go together, or which will complete the experiment, not something which will support the experiment. Cuttlefish cannot distinguish between geometrical shapes. This is something which is actually negating the experiment. If cuttlefish are not able to distinguish between geometric shapes, how would they have figured out the meaning of now, later and never? So because of this part actually undermining the experiment, we can eliminate this option. Cuttlefish wait longer than 100 seconds for the shrimp drawer to open up. Now, if they wait longer for their favorite food, that means they are displaying a lot of self-control. But this is something which is already established. We know that there was even a cuttlefish that was able to wait for 130 seconds waiting for shrimp. So every time the cuttlefish was waiting, researchers tried to add on 10 seconds, till the point that probably some cuttlefish would have given up and eaten the prawn. But the longest that cuttlefish could wait was already 130 seconds. So this is something which is known. So while this is supporting this particular finding, it's not actually complementing. It is the same thing. To be complementing, it has to be something new which takes the experiment in a slightly related direction, or which completes the experiment, perhaps looking at the social aspect or something like that. Since this is only supporting, probably this is not the right answer. But let's wait and see if there is something else which is complementing. If nothing is complementing, then we might have to go for this. Since this is something that is supporting but not complementing, we can eliminate it. Cuttlefish live in big social groups that exhibit sociability. Now again, this is something that we know is false because we know that cuttlefish are solitary. But if this was true, then we would be able to have the connect between a species being social and also being intelligent or having complex cognition. So this is something which is probably the right choice because it is complementing, or it is supporting the findings. It is supporting Schnell's findings because we already know that most animals that can display self-control have another trait in common, that is long social lives. And if this was true, then we would be able to prove that living in a social group is important for complex cognition. So this should be the correct choice. Just quickly looking at the fourth option, cuttlefish are equally fond of shrimp and raw prawn. Now this is something again which is undermining the experiment. If cuttlefish are equally fond of these two, why on earth would they wait for shrimp when prawn is already available? So this is also not something that makes sense. So we can go with the third option. In which one of the following scenarios would the cuttlefish's behavior demonstrate self-control? Now this is something that we already know from the experiment. If a cuttlefish is going to get shrimp later, but they have prawns now or crab now, they'll probably wait for shrimp. If they wait for shrimp, that means they are demonstrating self-control. So if they're getting crab now but waiting for prawns, or prawn now and waiting for shrimp, that is something which will demonstrate self-control. So those are the options which we have, but we also have to look at these shapes of triangle, square and so on. So we also know that the square means never, triangle means later and the circle means now. So that means we need to have a triangle for shrimp and a circle for prawn or for crab, preferably prawn, or we need to have a triangle for prawn and a circle for crab. But what would be preferable is them waiting for shrimp even if they are getting prawn now. That's because they don't like crab. So it might not be self-control. They might just really not want to have the crab. So a triangle for the shrimp and a circle for prawn is something which would be the best. Prawns are released while shore crab. So here it's the opposite. They're basically getting prawns now and crab after some time. Since they don't prefer crab, they don't even like it, this doesn't make sense, because none of us would choose to give up something which is okay to wait for something which is not what we want at all. Raw prawns are released while a live grass shrimp raw labeled with a square. This also doesn't make sense because of this one. Now, square is something which means never. If they know that they're never going to get the shrimp, it makes sense to eat the prawn. So there's no self-control to be displayed over here at all. Whereas if we see here, they're getting both crab and prawn right away, while grass shrimp is going to come in later because the triangle means later. So this is something which is displaying or which can be used to display self-control. Live grass shrimp are released while prawn is labeled with a circle and triangle. So one prawn is going to come later and one prawn is going to come now, but shrimp is already released. If they have their preferred food right away, why would they wait for something which they don't like as much? So again, this is not logical. So the third option is the right one out here. To answer this question, we've got to compare the original marshmallow test with the modified or the Schnell version of the marshmallow test. Now the differences that we already know was there were marshmallow in the original test and seafood in the modified one. There were children in the first test and cuttlefish in the modified one. The children also could be spoken to directly, but for the cuttlefish, there needs to be some form of non-verbal communication. That is something which they figured out by the basis of these shapes. So these are the things which we already know. Let's look out for options which are speaking about these and we can eliminate them. Now, verbal communication versus symbolic means of communication, this definitely is a point of difference. We've just spoken about it. The psychologist who took the test, the marshmallow test, could easily communicate to the children, hey, you can eat a marshmallow now or wait for 15 minutes and you get one more. That is of course something that we cannot do to fish. If we speak with them, they're not going to understand us. So this can get eliminated. Same way, the former had human subjects while the latter had cuttlefish. Again, something which can get eliminated because this again is absolutely right. Now, if we look at the first option, the former had performed over a longer time span than the latter. This is also something which is mentioned in the passage. Coming to this part, a long-term follow-up study showed that the children who waited for the second marshmallow had more success later in life. Now, this is something, of course, which hasn't been done with cuttlefish. There hasn't been a follow-up study. But when it came to children, they waited for longer, could be for a decade or even a couple of decades or maybe even longer to track success because these kids were really small. So this is also something which is a point of difference. So let's look at the third option now, which is the only one left. The former correlated self-control and future success, while the latter correlated self-control and survival advantages. So the first part is fine. Self-control and future success is something which was looked at in the human context, but self-control and survival advantages is something which has not been established. All that Schnell has established is that some cuttlefish are able to display self-control. We don't know if that leads to survival. Remember, we also spoke about how so far for every other species, a social life or social interaction is something which has been required. So this bit is something which is not a point of difference because it has not been established that the cuttlefish that displays more self-control is going to survive for longer. So because of that, this becomes the correct choice because we are looking for something which is not a point of difference. Now this is also something which you have to be careful of in the exam. Make sure that you don't miss words like except. So here, 3 of these are points of difference and whatever is left becomes the correct choice. Now we've already discussed what Schnell's experiment was. So let's eliminate the parts which were definitely part of her experiment, and whatever is left becomes the answer. Again, because we have the word cannot. Which of the following cannot be inferred from her experiment? Cuttlefish exert self-control with the help of diversions. This is something which was mentioned. Cuttlefish exert self-control with the help of diversions. This is something which is mentioned out here. They turn away from the king prawn as if to distract themselves. So this can be inferred, so we can eliminate it. Cuttlefish exercise choice when it comes to food. Definitely something which is a must-have for this experiment, because they prefer shrimp to prawns and pretty much anything to crab. So they definitely exercise choice. So this one's also out. Like human children, cuttlefish are capable of self-control. Again, something which is definitely true. We know that the cuttlefish did wait, and some cuttlefish waited till 130 seconds to have their favorite food. So this also is something which is true. Intelligence in a species is impossible without sociability. This is something which we cannot infer from her experiment. If you remember, cuttlefish are solitary creatures, but they do display self-control, which is a cornerstone of intelligence, which can lead to success, and self-control is also required to make critical decisions and so on. So if they are solitary, which means they are not social, and yet they exhibit self-control, we haven't proven that intelligence is impossible without sociability, because there are these fish which are probably intelligent. So this becomes the correct choice. So that's it then for this RC. I hope this was helpful, because pretty much every year in CAT we've seen some form of a scientific genre RC. So hopefully this helps you to take apart the RC, understand what it is about, and then use logic to solve the questions. So I'll see you in the next video.